Lived through the Iraq War. I saw hundreds of thousands of my fellow Iraqis be sent to their death for no apparent reason except to serve the agenda of Saddam Hussein. I lived under his brutal tyranny and I watched as my freedom was snatched away from me. The times of chaos and loss do not end as terrorist groups increased their presence in Iraq and revolutions and protests increased.
Since the Arab Spring began to spread and implement itself throughout the Middle East, more protests have arose and the crowds have grown larger. Many of us Sunni, the minority in Iraq right now, are being oppressed under the rule of Nouri al-Maliki. Arab Spring was successful in uniting large amounts of Iraqi residents to participate in more demonstrations that address both our past grievances and raising attention to removing Maliki from power.
The Arab Spring left lasting effects on the function and stability of the Iraq government. While there was cross-sectarian harmony between the Sunnis and Shiites protesting against the corrupt government of al-Maliki, that protest eventually grew into a conflict between the two groups. Finally, the cross-sectarian conflict resulted in the debilitation of Iraq and resulting in their heavy dependence on foreign intervention to function. Al-Maliki's marginalization of the Sunnis, corruption and misrule left the country weak and vulnerable. As the Arab Spring collided with the bitter legacy of the Iraq War, massive failures of the previous decade were exposed. Unresolved grievances led to people pouring onto the streets. Simmering tensions escalated into violence between the US-installed regime and the Sunni sections of the population that were alienated.
الله وسنكون أمامكم في
As a major global superpower, America plays a large role in foreign affairs, including in Iraq. The U.S. entered the Iraq War in order to remove Saddam Hussein from power due to his alleged ties to terrorism and weapons of mass destruction. Al-Maliki's corrupt government led to unhappiness among Iraqis of all sects and inspired Arab Spring protests in the nation. Additionally, the rise of terrorist organizations such as ISIS and Al-Qaeda were fostered by the U.S.-caused Iraqi war. The removal of Hussein led to a replacement government led by al-Maliki, as well as a U.S.-brokered constitution. Al-Maliki's corrupt rule led to unhappiness among Iraqis of all sects and inspired Arab Spring protests in the nation. Additionally, the rise of terrorist organizations such as Al-Qaeda and ISIS was fostered by the U.S.-caused Iraq war, which began problems that are still prevalent in the nation today.
I lived in the reign of Saddam Hussein, the Iraq-Iran war, the war with the US, and the infiltration of Al-Qaeda. In 1979, Saddam Hussein formally rose to power, after having served as a de facto head for Iraq for several years. He was part of the Sunni minority, which suppressed the Shia majority. He suppressed the Kurdish movements and overthrew the government. He maintained power during the Iraq-Iran war and the Gulf War. Declaring himself both president and prime minister of Iraq, he created a dictatorship. However, in 2003, a U.S. coalition invaded Iraq to dispose of Hussein due to his connections to terrorism and weapons of mass destruction. He was convicted of charges of crime against humanity and was sentenced to death by hanging. I saw Iraq transition between 3 different governments between the span of the years of 2003 to 2005. From 2003 to 2004, the Coalition Provisional Authority, or the CPA, was a transitional government created by the U.S., and they had executive, legislative, and judicial authority over the Iraqi government. Under the CPA, the Office of Reconstruction and Humanitarian Assistance, or the ORHA, was established by the U.S. before the invasion. The Iraqi interim government took the place of the CPA in 2004. It served as a caretaker government and was controlled by the U.S. Jay Garner was the interim civil administrator with 3 deputies, including Tim Cross. In May of 2003, L. Bremer replaced Garner. John Necropont replaced Bremer in 2004. He was the last U.S. interim administrator as parliamentary elections were held and the new constitution was drafted and ratified for the new Iraqi state. In 2005, the Democratic Iraqi Transitional Government was created and was headed by Prime Minister Ayad Alawi. In 2006, Nouri al-Maliki won the parliamentary elections and became Prime Minister of Iraq. He remained Prime Minister until 2014. Jalal Talabani, an Iraqi Kurdish politician, became President of Iraq and remained in the position until 2014 as well. The government succeeded the Iraqi transitional government. Besides changes in government structure, many citizens felt a lot more unsafe and unstable because of the increased terrorism in our home. After the removal of Hussein as leaders, the Shiites took over and suppressed the Sunnis. Angered by this oppression, Al-Qaeda and other terrorist groups decided to increase their presence in Iraq. Al-Musab al-Zawahiri was the head of Al-Qaeda. He was a Jordanian militant Islamist who was responsible for a series of bombings, beheadings, and attacks during the Iraq War. He was killed in 2006. In addition, local forces, usually former Sunni military, fought against the U.S. troops and the newly formed Iraqi state. Al-Qaeda continued to attack Shia civilians. An increase of U.S. troops in Iraq led to decrease in violence in 2007 and 2008, but eventually led to a civil war in Iraq when the U.S. pulled out in 2011. Living in Iraq has only gotten harder as the years have passed. Constant violence and protests caused an environment to form where no one ever felt safe and stable. Almost 165,000 civilians have died from direct war related to violence caused by the U.S., its allies, the Iraqi military and police, and opposition forces since the U.S. invasion of Iraq. Aerial bombings, shelling, gunshots, suicide attacks, and fires started by bombings have caused the death of so many Iraqi civilians. At least twice as many Iraqi civilians may have died as an indirect result of war because of the damage it caused. Damage to food, clean water, and the healthcare. This resulted in illness and infectious diseases and malnutrition that otherwise could have been prevented. A survey conducted in 2005 showed that children who were aged between 6 months and 5 years were malnourished, and that 25% of those interviewed for the survey were illiterate. $100 billion was committed to aiding and the reconstruction of Iraq after the Iraq War, but most of the country still suffers today from a lack of housing and access to clean drinking water. Iraq's relations with neighboring countries is characterized as tense, and it's always been tense. In 2008, the U.S. and Iraq agreed to a status of forces agreement, which stated that the government of Iraq requested that the U.S. forces stay in the nation to maintain security and stability. In 2009, Iraq became a part of the Chemical Weapons Convention. Since 2005, Iraq and Iran relations have improved steadily. Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki and President Jalal Talabani visited Iran frequently in order to emphasize bilateral cooperation. In 2009, tensions did slightly increase when Iraq accused Iran of seizing an oil well on the border. The relationship between Iraq and Turkey is tense as well because of the Kurdistan regional government. In 2011, the Turkish parliament renewed a law that allowed Turkish forces to pursue rebels over the border in Iraq. In 2007, the Iraq and its Neighbors initiative was launched. This initiative brought together leaders in Iraq and surrounding nations to help in the restabilization and reconstruction of new Iraq. Part of this initiative was the Marmara Declaration, a blueprint for regional peace process in Iraq. The purpose of this declaration was to reduce conflict across Iraq's borders and promote positive domestic and international relations. I have talked about all the hardships that I and others who live in this nation have faced because of our home. However, Iraq did not always have this many economic burdens. By 1980, Iraq had the second largest economy in the Arab world and the third largest economy in the Middle East. Iraq was characterized by a complex and centrally planned economy that was dominated by the state. However, Iraq's economy suffered many great burdens. For one, petroleum exports suffered during the Iraq-Iran war, and gross domestic product, or GDP, decreased. In addition, the invasion of Kuwait, Iraq's subsequent defeat in the Persian Gulf War, and the UN embargo that started in 1990 further harmed the economy. After 1990, little about Iraq's economy and financial system is known. It is assumed, however, that GDP levels continued to drop. The UN embargo continued to weaken the economy. Once the UN's Oil for Food program in 1997 was implemented, Iraq's GDP experienced positive annual growth. In 2003, the CPA took over Iraq's public sector. Iraq had accumulated a huge foreign debt because of Hussein's war expenses, but it was reduced in 2004 after a group of wealthy nations, the Paris Club, decided to cancel some of Iraq's debt. Oil production and economic development declined because of the Iraq War. Constant violence caused high inflation, high unemployment rates, outdated technology, and a distorted infrastructure. The Iraqi administrations that took over after the abolishment of the CPA continued reconstruction, however, it was extremely uneven. Somewhat secure areas like the Kurdish region saw great progress, while most of Iraq still suffered from the problems that the CPA had failed to fix. Finally, in 2007, when violence began to decrease, some economic improvements occurred, and inflation decreased. In 2009, oil revenues returned to pre-war levels. Despite the improvements that Iraq's economy made, recovery was still slowed because the corruption, violence, and poor infrastructure that remained in Iraq for so long continued to characterize the nation.
Still remember the day when we all heard about the variety of protests arising in countries such as Tunisia and Egypt. Mohammed Bouazizi was the man who eventually initiated this large-scale revolution by setting himself on fire in response to the government confiscating his fruit stand. Eventually, this demonstration inspired many, and the minority population of Sunnis in Iraq eventually rose and protested against our oppressive leader, Nouri al-Maliki. He is the sole reason for all of our problems and stress. We have large remains of bitter sentiments from the Iraq War, where the United States left us with numerous amounts of unsolved grievances. Abuses were committed disproportionately against Sunnis by the Iraqi security forces, and us Sunni believe that there is an obvious presence of unequal distribution of power among the sections. One of our spokesmen insisted that these protest movements are merely committed in order to maintain Iraq as a peaceful, novel concept in a city. Despite a long history of violent rebellions, we believe that our motives are not sectarian. While we have our contrasting religious beliefs over issues such as Friday prayer, we hope to instead focus on reforming a corrupt, abusive government that will benefit all of Iraq. It can be heard from any protester's cry. The people are chanting, "Leave, Maliki!" The people don't want you. The people want to topple the regime. The Sunni minority has faced nothing but oppression, and we want better lives and opportunities. None of this reform will happen under Maliki, and thus these protests are the only method we can turn to when we are denied any rights in how our country should be run. In fact, our government has refused to answer our protests in a civil manner. In order for Maliki to curtail his opponents, he has chosen brutal, inhumane ways to do so. He has tortured citizens. He has raped female prisoners. He had arbitrary arrests carried out. He even managed to successfully suppress an earlier attempt to organize Arab Spring demonstrations in Baghdad. Maliki is willing to do anything necessary to suppress our voices. It's just mad. The first protests occurred around February 12th, where hundreds of protesters, myself included, demanded for more effective approaches to the issue of national security, investigation into federal corruption cases, and government action toward making public services fair and accessible. This was somewhat successful. The government agreed to subsidize electricity costs, but failed to address any of our other needs. A few weeks later, protests grew so large that there was a particular time where it became known as the Day of Rage. This occurred on February 25th. These protests mainly focused on our nation's high unemployment, corruption, and poor public services. I remember crowds were storming into provincial buildings, jailbreaking prisoners, and forcing local officials to resign by any means necessary. At least 29 people died on this day. However, these protests further escalated between April and May. On April 9th, it was actually the anniversary of the fall of Saddam Hussein. The protests began to escalate, with nearly thousands of people protesting in Baghdad's Tahrir Square and nearly everywhere else in the country. Many of these protests went beyond our hatred for Maliki and extended to anger at U.S. occupation. A few weeks later, another protest broke out in anger because Maliki still remained prime minister despite his expired deadline for reform. In the end, Maliki agreed to resign in 2014, and the remaining Iraqi government stayed essentially the same. In addition to Sunni and Shia conflict, there were large protests in Iraqi Kurdistan as well. While I did not personally participate in the Kurdistan protests, I did hear that the Iraqi Kurdish protests were related to the protests in Turkey, Iran, and Syria. The movement largely called for the resignation of the cabinet and the disbanding of the Kurdistan regional government. The city of Sulaymaniyah, in particular, had a large amount of violent protests. Thousands of protesters came there, gathered together against the corruption and social injustices that they have faced. The demonstrations turned very violent. Protesters tried to storm into the headquarters of the Kurdistan Democratic Party and even threw rocks into there. However, the government responded very violently, shooting into the crowd and killing 2 while injuring 47. The protests eventually grew and expanded to places such as the Freedom Square. On April 19th, security forces stormed the main square of Sulaymaniyah to impose order and rid the demonstrations. While these forces were successful in doing so, they only increased tensions between civilians and authorities. Eventually, Iraqi Kurdistan expressed solidarity with Syria and Turkey, functioning as a sort of sanctuary for Kurdish leaders and refugees. The Arab Spring protests that were occurring in Iraq were mainly domestic with very little foreign interference. Ultimately, under the numerous amounts of political pressures at home, al-Maliki agreed to drop his bid for a 3rd term and pledged support for his brother instead, the more moderate Shiite Haider al-Abadi. This pleased most of the Sunni and ultimately brought an end to the protests that were happening in our corrupted, broken down country.
A few main parties that now make up the Council of Representatives include the Iraqi National Movement, the State of Law Commission, the Iraqi National Alliance, and the Kurdistan Alliance. Although the Arab Spring brought protests against the corrupt Iraq government, Iraq still continues to face issues against political instability, a declining economy, and sectionalism. Al-Sadir, an Iraqi politician, has called upon the government to dismiss a number of lawmakers and get rid of political patronage that encourages corruption and political deadlock in the country. He's especially critical of the ways in which oil revenues have been distributed, and he argues that oil revenues should be distributed among Iraqi citizens and not just to soak up for the government officials. Iraqi officials also warn that the protests threaten the stability of the state and inhibit its ability to effectively conduct its war against ISIS. They say that Iraq should be mobilizing its resources toward getting them out of the country, but now many are waiting to see whether demonstrators will storm the Green Zone, which is a representation of the sovereignty of the state. Secular tensions also continue in the current political atmosphere. Tension between Iraq's Shiite-led government and the Sunni population in Iraq has created a ripple of societal friction between the Shiites and Sunnis in particular. The manifestation of ISIS, some argue, is the result of years of frustration, disillusionment, and feelings of resentment among the contingent of Iraq's Sunni population towards the Shiite government. Iraq's current economy is also suffering. The cost of humanitarian work and reconstruction efforts in the face of ongoing conflict is huge, and they will present a lot of obstacles toward the country. Iraq's economy is vulnerable as oil constitutes 90% of the state's revenues. This means that the price of oil has a serious impact on the economic situation in Iraq. In light of the current declining oil prices, Iraq's resources are stretched ever thinner between the humanitarian needs and the demands of the war in ISIS.
From an objective point of view, America is the root cause of many of the problems that are taking place in Iraq today. The U.S. invaded Iraq in 2003 because they suspected ties to terrorism and weapons of mass destruction in post-9/11 Iraq. As a result of these invasions, Hussein was removed from power, and the U.S. controlled the nation for about a year and also established a U.S.-brokered constitution. This caused tensions between the Sunni minority and the Shia majority, allowing al-Qaeda, who thrived off the chaos, to rise to power. Al-Qaeda fought the joint forces of the U.S. troops and Iraqi state in a civil war. The Iraq War inspired other nations to overthrow their dictators, fueling the sparks of the Arab Spring movement. The U.S. set up the events of the Iraqi Arab Spring, as the removal of Saddam Hussein and the Sunni minority government and the replacement of the Shia majority caused the Sunnis to become unhappy with their conditions. There were also revolts against American troops, starting in Fallujah. Iraqis of all sects had a hatred for Americans for bringing the corrupt ruler al-Maliki to power, and Sunni Muslims especially were dissatisfied with their loss of power in the government. Many U.S. troops were killed throughout 2011 by militant groups and random attacks. June of 2011 was the bloodiest month for Americans in Iraq since June of 2009. These attacks were as a result of the Iraqi Arab Spring and represented Iraqi unhappiness with the conditions, especially American occupation in the country. This led Obama to speed up the removal of American troops in Iraq to hopefully ease some tensions between the Sunni and Shia and save some American lives. However, the removal of American troops only saw an increase in the amount of insurgencies and tensions among the Sunni and Shia. Once the U.S. withdrew from Iraq in late 2011, there was less structure and a lot of unanswered questions. Specifically, it allowed the Shias to discriminate against the Sunni minority. Sunnis felt as if they were being given less positions in the government and being abused more than other sects. To add to these growing tensions, a specific incident involving the detention of a Sunni government official's bodyguards caused Sunnis to feel attacked and began rebelling. Additionally, the rise of the Arab Spring and Saudi Arabian support for groups such as ISIS led to the rise of the power of ISIS that is now controlling Iraq and Syria, causing poverty and destruction in these nations. In the summer of 2014, the U.S. returned to Iraq and provided aerial support. The U.S. is currently playing a large role in fighting ISIS and attempting to aid civilians. The U.S. is currently working with the Iraqi army to block off the Islamic State from gaining control of any more territory, most recently in Mosul. A U.S. international coalition also previously prevented the Islamic State from gaining control of a territory that was up to a third of the size of Iraq. Meanwhile, Trump is currently attempting to control the situation by banning Iraqis from entering the U.S., including some who have previously worked alongside American forces in Iraq.